Igor, I've got a question I want to ask you.
Ruben, you know, it so happens that I have got a question I want to ask you. Do you often
eat oysters? Oh, we're both quite eager. So let me ask you again. Do you often eat oysters?
Oh no, I've never eaten one. My Aunt Helen has though. She says they taste like, well, rubber mixed with slime. And how about you? Have you ever eaten slimy oysters?
Rarely, but I can remember how slimy they were.
Well, now I have a taste witness that I can ask you.
Yeah, so they are, I would say, just like how your Aunt Helen described them. Slimy, quite soft and tender, but I wouldn't say that I'm personally a fan of oysters.
Me neither. Well, I've never tasted them, but I'm not a fan of killing them because, as you know, I like all animals.
But there was a time when they were eaten every day and actually even several times a day.
You mean dukes, earls, or kings ate them every day?
Well, no, not really. Mostly just ordinary people. We know that oysters were consumed in all possible ways.
Smaller oysters were often eaten raw.
All right. Larger oysters were fried in butter.
Good one. They were stewed with herbs and spices.
Oh, that sounds tasty. They were also deep fried.
And roasted.
As well as boiled in wine.
Yum, yum. And even baked in pies. To tell you the truth, Ruben, just a few centuries ago, you wouldn't even be allowed into the kitchen because you are not a woman. And cooking oysters and other food was considered a woman's job.
Well, I'm lucky that I can cook these days. I quite enjoy it.
Me too.
Do you know that when women boiled oysters in large pans, they might have looked like witches? They stirred the brew with a broom handle for 10 to 15 minutes. If there were many mollusks, several brooms had to be used.
No wonder the deadly illnesses spread so quickly, I ask you.
Yeah.
No sense of hygiene.
None at all.
Do you like the academic style of narration?
If I need to learn something, I'll certainly read some studies on that subject, yes.
Then it's high time I popped on my scientific hat and told you some scientific facts about oysters.
I'm all ears.
You'd better be. Oyster is the common name for a number of different families of saltwater bivalve mollusks. It's called bivalve, meaning it has two shells like a mussel. Yeah, by the way, this is a shell from an oyster. You can see my eyes through it, a bit like a mask, yeah?
I can. It's an uncomfortable mask, though, I imagine.
Yeah, quite right.
Don't you think they look like stones? I wonder how people guess there's actually something edible inside. Do you know what we can see inside those shells?
Definitely. Inside, there is a tension, drumbeat, mollusk, which has its internal organs, a mantle, and an extremely strong adductor muscle. This muscle helps the mollusk to close its shells when it senses danger. And also, I can punch you with it! Yeah, well, I do not want to be punched by an oyster. Do you, Ruben?
I mean, I'm just trying to imagine what that would feel like.
I think quite snotty.
Yeah, I guess don't underestimate them. That's what we should remember. Do you see that the shells are open now? It means that they are feeding by extracting algae and zooplankton and phytoplankton. In fact, they are almost constantly drawing water over their gills by opening and closing their shells.
There is a saying, we are what we eat. So if people eat oysters and oysters eat zooplankton and phytoplankton, then do you want to see what we eat when we eat oysters? Are you curious to know?
I'm very curious, yeah.
Here, sir, are these little creatures in a little droplet of water under a microscope. Bon appetit.
Oh, now my mouth is watering.
As far as I know, people live everywhere on Earth, independent of the climate. They don't seem to be picky. I wonder if oysters are also like that.
I wonder too. Have a look at the map. The red parts you can see show the main habitats of oysters on the Earth. They are found in the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. They live in marine or brackish habitats.
Well, yes, they do need the creature comforts to make their life enjoyable, such as shallow water,
temperate and clean coastal water,
and lots of plankton for us to eat. Yes, thank you, oyster. What sissies? Oi, what you are calling sissy? Can't even take care of themselves. Oh, yes, well, you couldn't if you were stuck to a rock.
highly dependent on society and despise loneliness.
Well, as Shakespeare said, you can't have too much of a good thing.
There is an idiom saying, birds of a feather flock together.
But, according to oysters, it should be oysters all shall sit together well. Don't you believe me? You can see for yourself. Be my guest. Here they are looking like a herd of lazy animals. They have attached themselves to the rocks and are perfectly content to spend all their lives here. Such clusters are known as a bed or an oyster reef.
Yes, and during low tides, vast oyster beds spreading for miles and miles become visible. Aren't you surprised? An enormous oyster field spreads from our toes right to the horizon.
Oh, Robin, you know, when you have seen as much life as I have, nothing will surprise you. Huge oyster beds were located in Colchester and Whitstable, by the coasts of Kent and Essex counties,
and delivered to London by the Thames. Here's a typical fishing village. In the background, there are fishing boats. It was usual for almost all locals to be involved in fishing or selling seafood.
To gather oysters in deep waters, man used a scraper with a net attached to it. The scraper was dragged along the bottom by a fishing boat. The scraper would go along the bottom of the sea and unstick the shells that would then go into the net. And women gathered oysters by hand during low tides. Look at these girls with their aprons full of oysters.
And have a look at the creels behind their bags. They must be rather heavy.
I wonder how long it took them to unstick each oyster of its rock.
Yes, it also requires being in a bent over position quite a lot.
Tremendously hard work. But I think for the oyster, the harder the better.
That's why they broke the routine, singing while gathering. Here is one famous song sung by oyster gatherers. The herring loves the merry moonlicht. The mackerel loves the wind. But the oyster loves the dredging song, for it comes o' the gentle king.
The streets of fishing villages were full of fishwives. They were easily recognized by typical clothes they were wearing and wicker creels they were carrying on their backs.
Have a look. The women are wearing their working dresses, which include a simple bedgown or jacket, an ankle-length striped skirt with a tucked hemline, and a striped apron which served as an extra bag to carry gathered seafood.
They usually wear a silk square. Oh, Robin, I'm rhyming. They usually wear
a silk square
at the neckline of their dresses, and upon it with the ribbons hanging down at the front.
And look, all the fishwives have one wicker creel on their backs and are also carrying a basket over their right arms as well as having a load in their aprons. Igor, do you consider yourself a businesslike person?
Certainly not. What makes you think that?
If you lived in a seaside town with shores full of free food, wouldn't you decide to gather this food and sell it in the town?
Over my dead body. Because it will not be me who brings about the death of oysters and other sea creatures. Wow, at last I've got an ally. I say with cold fury in my voice as I watch Ruben's smile falter and die.
However, that's what enterprising fishermen and oyster gatherers did. They sold oysters to street traders. Not everyone was willing to collect oysters by themselves. A lot of fishmongers' stalls selling oysters popped up throughout London.
Look, all these people are queuing to buy oysters.
The woman is smelling an oyster to see if it's fresh or not.
Or maybe if the salesperson looks away, she will gobble it down without leaving a trace. Ruben, I always see the best in people. Did you know that if you wanted to have a stationery stand, it was only possible if you paid for this opportunity to stand still and not go around pushing your cart?
Igor, how often do you eat food you've just bought right there on the spot?
Frankly speaking, I never do it. I do sometimes eat on the street. Oh, rhyming again. I do sometimes eat
something on the street. It was a common thing to do at an oyster stand. Look, the customer could eat oysters right at the stall and was offered some vinegar to go with them for free.
Yeah, free oysters, free oysters. Who wants free oysters? Oysters for free. Oh, you don't want them. Well, just thought you would.
It's kind to offer anyway, I guess. Shall we take a walk along Eastgate Street in Chester? Wherever we go, there are always stalls in sight.
This walk is a great opportunity to learn something from the traders. I've just asked one of the traders how fascinating. A dozen oysters cost 4p, half the price of a loaf of bread. They don't even count our uniqueness.
And I've just spotted a servant buying 3 to 4p worth of oysters. Poor girl was in such a hurry. Maybe she needed to go back to her masters and cook dinner.
Or maybe she was simply starving. Town streets were full of oyster traders walking from door to door and offering oysters to households.
Men or women lumbered with baskets full of oysters were a familiar sight in towns.
Street fishmongers who pushed carts were allowed to sell their goods unless they stopped and settled in one place.
Looking at this tired woman in the photograph, it's obvious she has just stopped for a photographer to take her picture.
And unless she quickly gathers her apron about her and trots away, not only will the photographer have to pay her, but she will have to pay the prissy policeman as well. On second thoughts, Ruben, it's not that easy to casually trot away when you have a heavy wheelbarrow of oysters to sell.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I know a popular Irish folk song about a girl selling seafood on the streets of Dublin.
The girl was called Molly Malone, and the song is called Cockles and Mussels, or In Dublin's Fair City.
Right you are, Ruben. And by the way, here is the monument to Molly Malone in Churchwain Street in Dublin. In Dublin's fair city, where the girls are so pretty, I first set my eyes on sweet Molly Malone.
As she wheeled her wheelbarrow through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh.
Alive, alive, oh.
Alive, alive, oh.
Crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh.
She washed...
She washed a fishmonger! Seriously!
That's what she does in her spare time. It's okay. At least we got to the end of that verse.
She washed a fishmonger.
I didn't say it that time. That's what I said the first time. Okay. Focus. She was a fishmonger, and sure 'twas no wonder, for so were her father and mother before.
And they both wheeled their barrows through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh.
Alive, alive, oh.
Alive, alive, oh.
Crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh.
Oysters were so cheap because they were really abundant.
And why? Because they were brought to inland towns from all the shores, and they were sold everywhere for
Peanuts.
peanuts.
The purchased oysters were taken home.
Or even eaten straight from the barrel at street stalls.
Or served in oyster cellars. What's an oyster cellar? It's a building where you eat oysters. What's a building? It's a it's like a brick shell. Oh, I see.
I think the oyster needs to go to school.
Yeah, how to explain to an oyster what's a building? It's a shell made from a brick.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good definition.
Fair enough.
And in these oyster cellars, where they were often accompanied by bread generously spread with margarine.
The bread would add to the price of the dish, but pepper and vinegar were offered for free, in case you want some oysters.
As Dickens Sam Weller from Pickwick Papers remarks, poverty and oysters always seem to go together. The poorer a place is, the greater call there seems for oysters.
Indeed.
Look here, sir. Here's an oyster stall to every half dozen houses, the streets lined with them. Blessed if I don't think that when a man's very poor, he rushes out of his lodgings and eats oysters in regular desperation.
How strange it sounds today. People who couldn't afford meat bought oysters. Yes, of course. It's so humiliating. Oh, yeah, at least we did save the population of cows.
In the 19th century London, there lived Henry Mayhew, a publicist and journalist. Here he is in the picture. You can see the original cover of his illustrated book called London Labour and the London Poor. He became famous when this book was published in 1851. In his book, he described the life of the lower classes of the London society: unqualified workers, street traders, beggars, and thieves.
Oh yes, I have read some parts of the book, and I remember that Henry Mayhew once interviewed an oyster seller. She said that her customers were people of all sorts: impoverished gentlemen, hard-up clergymen, street traders, and workers and tradespeople all came to feast there on her marvelous oysters. Oh, at least one compliment.
Igor, do you know the most popular Victorian dish among poor people?
Poor people. Let's think. Could poor people afford an apple cake?
Have another go.
English muffins.
Nope.
Pudding with fermented oysters.
Wrong again. It was actually beef and oyster pie.
Should have guessed.
You should have done. 6 oysters could be used by poorer Londoners as the basis for this traditional pie with a suet crust, a pound of inferior steak, onions and carrots, and a rich sauce based on a pint of porter or stout.
Let's have a look at this photo. The photographer captured a street of one of the towns of North Yorkshire. Footnote: it is illegal to capture streets unless you are William the Conqueror, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan. Oh, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan. Strange. Well, yeah, I can't blame history. Unless you are some kind of warrior, well, a very VIP kind of warrior, you can not conquer them. If you are a warrior, you can conquer them off with impunity. Let's imagine that now the women who happen to live upon the conquered street are opening oysters to make an oyster pie.
During the 18th century, one type of oyster became unexpectedly popular.
And rancorous.
Definitely. But it was popular only among those of higher social status. These oysters had very unusual colorings and were very expensive. The bodies of the mollusks were green.
A question for the viewers. What made them green? A. Did they put the oysters into an aquarium full of green algae? B. Did they cover them in arsenic to make them look green? Footnote, arsenic is very poisonous. You would not want to consume this lethal delicacy. And C, did they put the oysters in a compost heap to make them sick and green? Oysters developed green beards of harmless algae in September. Green oysters were considered a delicacy compared to their common white counterparts.
It was an idea of local salesmen who collected them and put them into pits dug in the salt marshes for 6 to 8 weeks, turning them green.
Demand for oysters was really high in 19th century Britain.
Yes, as many as 80 million oysters a year were transported from Whitstable to London's Billingsgate market alone.
And here we are now right in the middle of Billingsgate Market. How interesting. We see a ship which has brought products.
The traders sold seafood to local market sellers, and we can see a huge, for that time, market next to the harbour.
Robin, do you know that London was considered one of the world's oyster capitals, as well as New York and Paris?
No wonder. The average amount of oysters eaten in London in a year numbered 500 million oysters in 1850.
Oysters became an essential part of people's lives. Books devoted to oysters were published. They taught where to find oysters and how to cook and eat them.
Just the other day, I came across a medieval English recipe. I'll read an original recipe in Old English. Will you try to translate it into modern English?
Fire away, Robin.
Okay. Take and sholahom and setherhom in clean water.
First, shell off the oysters and boil them in clean water.
Grind a pepper and saffron with bread and ale.
Mix grounded pepper and saffron with bread and ale.
Temper it up with the same brothy and do the oysters therein and let it boil.
Boil the oysters in the broth.
Cast salt therein and messe it forthy.
Salt the mixture and serve it forth. I think
True.
all our viewers now have the same question. Oysters consist of a mollusk itself and its shell. If mollusks were eaten, what happened to the shells?
This is actually a very serious problem for the city. The streets of poor neighbourhoods in Victorian London were covered in oyster shells.
Very recently, well, just a few years ago, during foundation works of Preston Market for the new indoor market hall, workmen uncovered thousands of shells in pits beneath the old cobbles.
Yes, I remember reading about it. These shells date back to Victorian times when fishwives used to sell them by the ton to the poor people of Preston.
Oh, yes, and according to the experts, the locations of the shell pits match with those sections of the market where the shellfish stalls were situated.
Probably that's how the city was trying to find a solution to the problem of shells being scattered around the streets. And the market traders were asked to take their castaways outside the city. However, the market traders were too tired to go anywhere after a hard working day, so they made pits and put castaway shells in them.
Here is a photo of Preston Market with the market stalls selling seafood. This is where the shell castaways were found a few years ago. When did the wind of change start to blow?
By mid-19th century, the number of oysters in England dropped to practically zero. America generously shared its oyster crops with London. Fishermen from New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey states supplied England with hundreds of millions of oysters every year, helping London to keep its status as an oyster capital of Europe.
That's probably how the number of oysters fell. It's because, well, the oyster growth rate in the places where they were collected was lower than the rate of their consumption. There is a balance between all the units of the food chain. People have disturbed this balance, thus oysters became scarce.
Even the fact that people started farming oysters couldn't contribute to recovering the population of oysters. According to the market laws, the higher the quantity supplied, the lower the prices, and the lower the quantity supplied, the higher the prices.
You are very wise, Robin.
Thank you for saying so. Now, a portion containing 2 oysters in restaurants of London costs about £7, and in supermarkets you'll have to pay £4 for a couple of them.
Remember, in the 18th of not November, but century, you could buy a sack full of oysters for just 3-4 pence.
In restaurants, you get them beautifully arranged on a platter of ice, accompanied by lemon and different sauces. They say good things come in small packages.
Now, Ruben, I'm going to say this as a monk. What a solemn procession!
What a great impression of a monk, Brother Igor. May God bless you. Unfortunately, it's now time to say goodbye.
I'll be looking forward to seeing you in our next program about American oysters.
Ooh, great. I can't wait to talk more about these mystifying mollusks.
Excellent. Okay, great. We did it again.